Well, good morning and welcome, everyone. I'm going to do something a little bit different. Rudy was not able to join us this month, so I'm going to do a two-part series. So that's a teaser ad for being back next week. And this Sunday, we're going to do what I call a teaching lesson. And next Sunday, it'll be a preaching lesson. So this Sunday, we're going to look at the book of Genesis from a teaching perspective. So let's move into our slideshow here. Start from the beginning. Yes, there we go. All righty. What you are looking at here is a picture of the Roman aqueducts that are still there in Israel. On the left-hand side of the aqueduct is actually the Mediterranean Sea, but these were built thousands of years ago and they're still there, and with a little repair work, apparently they would still work. So as I said, we're going to be talking, this is going to be a teaching lesson, not a preaching lesson. Because I think it's important for us to recognize that there is a history of the Bible and there is a history in the Bible. In other words, there is a history of the Bible and how this book, this document that we now read was created, as opposed to the history that's embedded in the Bible. Now, at certain points, surely they cross. But I think it's important that we sometimes step back a little bit and say, how was this book? How do we read it now in English, understandably, the sentences make sense, all of that, without understanding a little bit about the history of the Bible. So today, we're going to focus solely on the Tanakh, what Christians call the Old Testament, with emphasis on Genesis. What is the Tanakh? How was it created? Why was it created? What was the purpose? And what can we historically know or discern as we study the history of the Bible, as well as the history in the Bible? First and foremost, I think it's so important for us to understand that in the Jewish tradition, there is no such thing as an Old Testament. They have a testament. This is a Christian overlay. Many of the versions of the Bible that we all read were translated, edited, and published by Christian authors, by Christian publishing houses. So many of the versions of the Bible that you read are edited from the perspective that the Old Testament is a foretelling of the New. How do you know that? Well, if you look in the footnotes of your Bible, or sometimes Bibles have side notes, you might see passages that say, this passage foretells the birth of Jesus. Like if you go into Matthew chapter 1, there might be a reference there. But my friends, I need you to hear this. The Tanakh was not a foretelling of Jesus. This is a denigration of a rich faith tradition that Jesus himself would have understood and practiced throughout his life. And it clouds our understanding of the evolution of faith in human history. It's also misleading to call it Hebrew scriptures, which for a long time I did that too, because not all the scriptures were written in Hebrew, and the religion of the people is Israelite, not Hebrew. And also remember too, it's not Jewish. Jewish came after the fall of the temple in 70. So we're talking a long, long time before that happened. The Tanakh is an acronym for Torah, Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. The Torah, or the Pentateuch, the 5 books, the first 5 books of the Bible, I think most of us recognize. Then the Nevi'im are the prophets, the former, the latter, and the minor prophets, like, for example, Isaiah, Jeremiah, those prophets. And last is what we call the writings or wisdom literature for the Proverbs and Psalms, the Song of Solomon, those kinds of books. Now, interestingly enough, in the Tanakh, in the Jewish Bible, there is only 24 books. In the Protestant Bible, there are 39. The Catholics go one better, there's 46. So you see how this Christian overlay infiltrates the book that we now call the Bible, and we say, oh, that's the Jewish part of it. Well, it's got a lot of extra stuff in it that wasn't there initially. How were these books crafted? And I intentionally use the word craft instead of written, because we must remember that no one sat down one night and said, they opened their laptop and said, I'm going to write the Bible. This is my calling. We are talking about oral tradition. We are talking about stories of wandering tribes that, and hear this, had no relationship to one another. They were just wandering tribes. So the stories are fluid because nothing is written down. And my friends, hear this too. This is also true about the first of the four Gospels. For a long time, they were fluid. Nothing was written down. And there comes a shift that the stories lived in memory rather than the experience. Now, let me explain that. For many of these tribes, they did not actually experience a flood story, as an example, knowing the flood, but they had a memory, a collective memory of flood stories. And where this came into high relief is in 1849, the book, The Epic of Gilgamesh, was discovered and translated. In the book of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Sumerian journals from Mesopotamia, there's a flood story. There's a Garden of Eden story. Oh my gosh, that means that it wasn't only in the Bible. See, when we get this rigid structure about God said, and it's all in the Bible, and it's very literal, we miss the larger story of humanity that is playing out through the pages of this book. Genesis then becomes a rich source for understanding the evolution of humanity as human. Now, I just think this stuff is so fascinating. What about the evolution of consciousness? We have to understand that the brain with which we read the Bible is not the brain of people who created the Bible, who created these stories. What we are seeing throughout the course of the Tanakh is really the development of the human brain. This is so fascinating. You see, at first, we talk about the reptilian brain, and I'm sure probably all of you have heard that term. And the reptilian brain is the brain in the back of our head, which was fight or flight, that's survival. We talk about this reptilian brain. Well, that's the brain we first had, all right? It's an ancient brain. It's just a half a step above an animal. Okay, we lived instinctually, we lived by the water, we lived by the seasons, we were nomadic just as the animals were. But slowly but surely, over thousands of years, we begin to see pictures on walls. Language and writing begins to be developed. And then comes the development of legacy through the family. And this we see, of course, in the Abraham story, how Abraham's family is called out of Mesopotamia and they moved to the Fertile Crescent. That's that story. All right. Why were the stories written? Why not just leave them as fluid stories that we all talked about around the campfire? My friends, there is always a purpose and an agenda. We are defining a people who belonged to my tribe and who didn't. We shared stories, all right? There's the shift from nomadic people that told each other their stories to being in the land. We began to cultivate. We began to farm the land. We stopped the migration. Of course, many did not, but I mean, there were certain places of civilization, what we would call civilization, and we began to collect the stories that we all shared. Now, again, this is very similar to the Gospels, where certain groups of people shared certain stories. They collected those stories and called them the Gospel according to John, Matthew, Mark, whatever it was. But they also defined who was in charge and who had legitimate power. That legacy thing, from my son, from my father, to my son, to my son, to my son. Who has the power? And also, who owned the land? This is a drawing of what we call the ancient cosmology. The ancient people believed that it was the great, there was a dome in the heavens, and above that dome, it was the realm of God, and there were windows. Remember the song? Windows of heaven are open, showers of blessings outpour. You see the little windows of heaven. Then there is the earth, the sea, and below that is Sheol. Now, in the Tanakh, Sheol, and even in the New Testament for that matter, it was not considered hell. This was just the resting place of the dead. Where did you bury the dead? In the ground. And if you dug them up years later without fancy coffins, they were part of the ground. So Sheol did not have the same, theology as we later in the Christian tradition gave it. When were the books written? You know, if we've got all these years of wandering tribes, and then we have the mass migrations, and then we have the beginnings of settlements, when, historically, do we believe the books were written? We believe they were written sometime within 1000 to 962 BCE, before the Common Era. And remember, time goes backwards in the Common Era, before the Common Era. We don't really have concrete historical proof that David actually existed, but we do believe that someone with power, with intelligence, with weaponry, with an army was a great and mighty warrior hero. And of course, we see this in our own legends in America. Paul Bunyan and the Blue Ox. Did he really exist? Did he have a blue ox? But it's part of our tales. And here's the golden boy himself, King David, and this statue is in the old city of Jerusalem. Why do we think it happened then? Because what David did, or the David character, there was a consolidation of political power. In other words, there was a time of peace. And whether you know it or not, peace is always artistic. Peace is a time when the arts flourish. So we see art, music, language flourish during this time of political rest instead of political unrest. And isn't it odd that we attribute to David the Psalms, the Book of Solomon, his great wisdoms? We see the Proverbs being written, the wisdom books. We see the older books of the Testament being written, Genesis, Exodus. So they wanted to preserve the stories of the tribe that began to form under David. And all that beginning in chapter 5 of Genesis, you know, if you ever have trouble sleeping at night, you just pull that chapter out, and within minutes, I guarantee a sound night's sleep. But there was a purpose in that begetting. There wasn't just, let's just record a bunch of people. No, it is to show that David and his son Solomon were the rightful kings after Saul and his sons died. Let's look at some things from antiquity. Here is a picture of a receipt from Amazon.com. I think I bought a sheep and 2 cows on this particular transaction. The cuneiform tablets are the earliest known writing that we have from Mesopotamia. Of course, they were written on wet clay. They are made by a stick. And what they're really, the earliest forms of writing were all about transactions. What I purchased, what you purchased, what you're giving me in return. Another statue from antiquities is the Mother Goddess statue. I want you to notice a couple things about this statue. Number one, this is not our ideal woman. This is not the picture in the 21st century that we say, that's it. It looks nothing like Kim Kardashian. Okay, nothing. But what this statuary is of the Mother Earth on the birthing chair. She is giving birth at this point. You will see that her hands are resting on what looks like to be 2 lions. So in other words, she is ruler over all. That's exactly what this imagery is all about. And you will also notice something very unique, which I'm sure you've already figured out. There is no presence of a male figure. So let's talk about the role of the feminine in the Old Testament. Now, lest you think I'm going into feminist theology, no. I want us to get an understanding of how we are developing as a human species and some of the things and some of the ideas that we think are so new that are not so new at all. The role of the feminine from the very earliest times is the question of birth and blood. Now, this is not a statement, gentlemen, about putting down men. We're not going there. What I'm saying to you is, from the earliest times, women were revered because women and only women could give birth. There was a mystery, there was a magic, and there was a power in women that men did not have. Also, the issue of blood, because a woman at a regular basis would release in the menstrual cycle a great amount of blood. But if a man had to bleed like that, he would die. And so there is always this sort of awe and respect by men of the woman and of the feminine. At the same time, there was also the sort of distrust or the uncomfortableness that she always had and still does to this day, my friends, the ultimate power, and that is to give life. 25,000 years ago, the Stone Age female goddess, which is the statuary we just looked at, she reigns alone and she reigns supreme. By 7,000, the Neolithic age of beginnings of civilization, and again, this is the development of the human brain. Okay, a cow doesn't really sit in a pasture and go, I need, let's see, if I'm going to have a calf, I need a bull. A cow never goes that, can't go there. But humankind began to understand that the woman did not give birth alone, which previously it was just a magical thing. And as Mama used to say, they decided it takes 2 to tango. But the man was a consort. In other words, he had no power. Think of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip. He was her consort, but he did not have power. Okay, so these things continue to play out even to today. Around 2,000 years ago, we see the migrations from the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia, through the Fertile Crescent. And what we are introduced to is a male god of the sky called Yahweh. We hadn't seen him before. The gods and goddesses of earth did not move from place to place. There was a god of the river, and there was a goddess of the threshold, and there was all these amulets. And we see this in the story of Isaac and Rebekah, where she tries to take her father's amulets and she hides them under her saddle. But the gods and goddesses had no power in the new land because they belonged to the land. It was only the sky god of Yahweh that moved from place to place. Slowly but surely, as we began more and more cultivation, we buried seeds in the ground and they bore fruit. Therefore, we plant a seed in the woman, she now becomes a container. So you see, over the course of thousands of years and the development of the human brain and the ability to logically think through a process, women now become passive and have no power. They are simply a container for the seed. Then we see the time of monarchy, David and Saul, David and Solomon. And it becomes important for inheritance and the bloodline. Remember, inheritance and land and power passed from father to son to son. Around 800 BCE is the beginning of the religious reforms to end the worship of the goddess, and the goddess's name was Baal, B-A-A-L. And we see this throughout all the Old Testament. One of the most famous parts is Elijah's confrontation of the false prophets. See, there weren't false prophets of Baal, but according to the sky god Yahweh, they were. In 1 King, and here is Elijah on Mount Carmel, raining down the fire that would kill the false prophets of Baal. So it's all in there. And it's so subtle and it's kind of below the surface that it's hard. We read the Bible, especially like Genesis, from a religious point of view or perspective. But when we read it from a historical point of view and perspective, we learn a whole lot more. We learn that there's the history of human development. We learn the evolution of faith. We learn about the divine sanction of power. Excuse me. How do we inaugurate a president? He puts his hand on the divine book of power. And rightful land ownership. Who owns the land? And oh, my friends, please hear me on this rightful ownership of land. When God said to Abraham, go into the area now of Palestine, of Israel, there was already somebody living there. These were the people who worshiped Baal. And the conflicts and the wars went on and on and on for thousands of years. And in 1947, the United States and Great Britain did the same thing. After the Second World War, they sent the Jews back to Israel, but somebody was already living there. What you have to understand, and I don't think, honestly, bless their hearts, but I don't know that our diplomats really get how old and ancient these wars are over this land of Palestine and Israel. And it is ongoing to this day. And the other one, of course, is the secondary role of women. And my friends, if you think, segueing on to a moment of political statement, if you think this confrontation that is happening right now is about abortion, it is not. It is about the secondary role of women and power that has lived within the psyche of both women and men for thousands and thousands of years. All right, let's talk about how we got these books written. Scholars believe there are 4 schools of thought, and note the timelines here. what we call the J writers, David and Solomon, who were responsible for most of Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers, the storyline that gave them power. The name is derived from Yahweh, which in German is Jehovah, and therefore it's called J. The J source is well known for its highly human anthropomorphic God who has a close relationship with humans. At the same time, a group of people who called God Elohim. Have you ever wondered why God has a bunch of names in Genesis? They were from the priestly or prophetic school in the north. Where is David and Solomon? In the south. So you see, this conflict is embedded right there in the book of Genesis. God is more distant from the people. He typically communicates with dreams and messengers and prophets. The other two schools of thought are the D writers, and guess what they're responsible for? The book of Deuteronomy, a group that refers to the priestly writers who created and crafted this one singular book. They're characterized by a unique preaching style and insist that God cannot be seen. Remember when God passed by Moses, he had to hide his face because Moses could not see God or he would die. That's a Deuteronomy edition. And then the priestly writers, check the dates. This is post-Babylonian captivity. They were the priestly writers, the traditionalists, who would want to renew the covenant after the tribe came back home after the Babylonian captivity. They had a strong interest in order and boundaries, as well as a temple-based system. This is the Israelite religion Jesus of Nazareth knew. Check out the dates. They are wholly responsible for the book of Leviticus, insertion into Numbers and Genesis as well. So, my friends, here's your assignment. This is a teaching module, not a preaching module, so you have homework. I want you to spend some time, and it's only 3 pages. This is not a big assignment. I want you to read the first 2 chapters of Genesis, but I want you to read them in reverse order. Chapter 2 is the older version of the Genesis story. It is written by the J writers who saw a God that was human, who walked and talked. And we sang the song, He Walks in the Garden with Us. That's where the J writers' strength is. Then I want you to read chapter 1 by the E writers, that very beautiful, prosaic, the cadence and the first day and the second day, and God saw that it was good. And next week, we're going to look at what was being talked about in chapter 1 of Genesis that was very different than chapter 2. So I hope you enjoyed. I know it's a lot of history, but I think if you got a good Bible with a lot of good footnotes, you will see these themes playing through. And to read chapter 2, take your time, really embrace it, and then go back and read chapter 1. I think you will find it a most fascinating study.